Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And you know me, I love to dig into topics that can really make a difference in our lives. And today,
Yeah.
we're tackling something,
Big.
big and often pretty tough to talk about. Helping kids and teens cope with grief and loss. It's something most of us will face at some point, either personally or in supporting loved ones. So we want to equip you with some really practical tools and insights.
Exactly.
So to guide us on this deep dive, we're turning to an amazing resource, a course called Creativity as a Tool to Help Children and Adolescents Going Through Bereavement and Loss. It's by Ursula Sisa, a really experienced, accredited play therapist.
I was so impressed by Ursula's credentials. She's been working with children and families for years, and she really understands the power of play and creativity in helping kids process tough emotions.
Yeah, and play therapy. That's not just about, letting kids run wild.
Yeah.
It's about using play as a language to help them express themselves, especially when words just aren't enough.
Right on.
Yeah.
And that's especially true when we're talking about grief. It can be so hard for kids and teens to articulate what they're feeling. So giving them these creative outlets can be a game changer.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore some of the key takeaways from Ursula's course and how you can put them into practice in your own families or even in your classrooms if you're an educator. Because let's face it, loss touches all of us in some way.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
So let's jump right in. One of the things Ursula emphasizes is that creativity can be this incredible tool for kids to express their grief. It's like a secret language they can use when words feel too big or too scary.
That's such a powerful way to put it, a secret language.
Yeah.
I love that. So what are some examples of how this can actually work? Like what kinds of creative activities can we encourage?
Well, Ursula talks a lot about collage making, which is something that can be really effective even for younger kids. They can cut out pictures, words, textures, anything that speaks to them and kind of piece together their feelings visually.
I can see how that would be less intimidating than, sitting down and saying, okay, tell me how you feel about losing your grandma.
Right. And it allows them to express those jumbled up emotions that often come with grief.
And for teens who might be, more into words than pictures.
Ursula suggests journaling or even creative writing prompts. Like imagine writing a letter to the person you've lost, or maybe crafting a story where they're still present in some way.
That's a great way to help them process those complex emotions and maybe even start to make sense of things.
And it's important to remember that grief looks different at different ages. You know, a 5-year-old's understanding of death is going to be way different from a teenager's.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. When you're little, death can seem like this abstract concept, like maybe the person has just gone on a trip. But as you get older, that finality really hits you.
Exactly. And Ursula does a great job of breaking down those developmental stages of grief. So for young kids, she stresses the importance of clear, simple explanations about death.
So no more telling kids that grandpa's just sleeping.
Right, because that can lead to a lot of confusion and anxiety. We need to be honest and direct, but in an age-appropriate way.
And for teenagers who are already grappling with so much emotionally and hormonally.
Grief can add this whole other layer of complexity. They might start questioning everything life-death, their place in the world. It can be really intense.
So how can we as parents or carers support them through that without, trying to fix things or downplay their feelings?
That's where creating that safe space for them to express themselves becomes crucial. Whether it's through creative outlets, talking it out, or just sitting in silence with them, we need to let them know that it's okay to feel all those big, confusing emotions.
And that we're there for them no matter what.
Exactly. It's about providing that unconditional support and understanding, even when we don't have all the answers.
That's already giving me so much to think about. It feels like we're shifting from this idea of grief as something to be feared or avoided to something that can actually be explored and processed, maybe even healed through creativity.
That's a great way to sum it up. And, it's not just about supporting kids through grief.
Right. It's about supporting ourselves, too. We can't pour from an empty cup, as they say.
Exactly. And that's why Ursula dedicates a whole section of her course to self-care for adults. Because if we're not taking care of our own emotional well-being, we're not going to be able to show up for the kids in our lives the way they need us to.
I think that's a perfect segue into our next part, where we'll dive deeper into those practical strategies for supporting both kids and ourselves through grief.
Sounds good. I'm ready when you are.
Awesome. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
All right, we're back and ready to dig deeper into those strategies for helping kids and teens through grief. And I'm curious, we talked about how creativity can be this powerful outlet, but what are some specific things parents and carers can do to actually make that happen?
Well, Ursula makes a really important point in her course. She says there's no one-size-fits-all approach to grief. It's such a unique and individual experience.
Right, like we can't expect every child to grieve in the same way or on the same
Mm.
timeline. Exactly, and that's why it's so crucial to really observe and pay attention to how each child is expressing themselves.
So instead of trying to force them into some predetermined mold of what grief should look like, we need to meet them where they are.
Exactly, and that might mean being open to some pretty unconventional expressions of grief.
Like what?
Well, Ursula gives some really interesting examples in the course. She talks about one child who found solace in building elaborate Lego structures after a loss.
Wow. So it wasn't even about, drawing or writing or anything traditionally artistic. It was
Yeah.
about using those building blocks to maybe create a sense of order or control
Yeah.
in a world that suddenly felt chaotic.
That's a great interpretation. And she mentions another child who would spend hours meticulously drawing incredibly detailed pictures.
So it sounds like it's less about the specific activity and more about finding what resonates with each individual child.
Absolutely. And that's where trusting our instincts as parents and carers comes in.
Right.
We know our kids best, so we're often the first to notice those subtle shifts in their behavior or their emotional state.
But that can be tough sometimes, right? Especially if we're grieving ourselves. It's easy to get caught up in our own emotions and maybe miss those cues from our kids.
You're so right. And that's why Ursula stresses the importance of self-care for adults. Because if we're running on empty emotionally, we're not going to be able to show up for the kids in our lives the way they need us to.
It's like that oxygen mask on an airplane. You got to put your own on first before you can help others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And engaging in our own creative outlets can be a powerful form of self-care. It allows us to process our own emotions, and it also models healthy coping mechanisms for our kids.
I love that idea. It's
Yeah.
like we're all in this together, learning and growing from each other's experiences.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to teach kids how to cope with tough emotions is to show them how we do it ourselves.
Makes sense. So we've talked a lot about the power of creativity, but I'm also wondering about those times when, a child might need more support than we can provide at home.
That's a really important point to address, and Ursula does talk about that in her course. She dedicates a whole section to recognizing red flags that might indicate a child is struggling and could benefit from professional help.
This feels especially crucial because as parents and carers, we want to do everything we can to protect our kids. But sometimes that means knowing when to seek outside support.
Absolutely. And sometimes it can be hard to admit that we need help, but it's always better to err on the side of caution.
So what are some of those warning signs that parents and carers should be looking out for?
Ursula provides a really helpful checklist in the course. Things like prolonged social withdrawal, changes in sleep or eating patterns, extreme irritability or anger, and of course, any talk or behavior related to self-harm.
That checklist sounds like an incredible resource for parents who might be feeling unsure or overwhelmed. It's like having a guide to help them navigate those tricky situations.
And remember, seeking professional help is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength. It means we're willing to do whatever it takes to support our child's well-being.
I think it's a really powerful message to send. So it sounds like this course covers a pretty broad spectrum, from those everyday creative activities to recognizing when a child might need more specialized support.
It does. And it's presented in a way that's both practical and compassionate. Ursula really understands the nuances of childhood grief, and she offers a framework for understanding it that feels both accessible and empowering.
That's great to hear. Because I think sometimes when we're dealing with grief, especially with kids, it can feel like we're just stumbling around in the dark hoping we're doing the right thing.
I hear you. And that's why having resources like this course can be so valuable. It's like having a flashlight to help us see the path forward.
Exactly. And one of the things that keeps coming up for me is this idea of validation. Just letting kids know that whatever they're feeling is okay. There's no right or wrong way to grieve.
Absolutely. And that's such a powerful message for kids to hear, especially when they're already feeling so lost and confused.
Because even if we don't understand their grief or we don't know how to fix it, we can still validate their experience. We can still let them know that they're seen and heard and loved.
Exactly. And that can make all the difference.
So this conversation has been so insightful. I feel like I'm already gaining a deeper understanding of how to approach this topic with more compassion and empathy.
I'm glad to hear that. And I think that's a testament to Ursula's work. She really has a gift for breaking down these complex concepts in a way that's relatable and actionable.
Agreed. So before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear more about how we can actually integrate these creative activities into our daily lives. It's one thing to understand the theory, but I think parents and carers are probably eager for some practical tips and guidance.
You're absolutely right. It's not enough to just talk about the benefits of creativity. We need to figure out how to make it happen in our busy lives.
Right, because who has time for, hour-long art therapy sessions every day?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Ursula suggests thinking about it less as art therapy and more as just incorporating creative moments into our everyday routines.
So it's about finding those little pockets of time where we can weave in some creativity.
Exactly. Like maybe you set up a dedicated creative corner in your home where art supplies or musical instruments or whatever your child is into are readily available.
I love that idea. It's like sending a silent invitation for kids to explore their creativity whenever the mood strikes them.
Exactly. And it normalizes creativity as a part of everyday life,
Yeah.
not just something you do in a structured classroom setting.
And it doesn't have to be anything fancy or elaborate. It could be as simple as, coloring together while you're having coffee in the morning,
Yeah.
or putting on some music and dancing around the living room.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of those quiet, unstructured moments, too, like just cuddling up with a good book or going for a walk in nature. Those can be really powerful opportunities for connection and emotional processing.
Yeah. Sometimes it's about just being present with our kids and creating that space for them to share whatever they're feeling.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to be a master artist or musician to encourage creativity in your kids. It's about the process, not the product.
So true. It's about giving ourselves and our kids permission to experiment, to make mistakes, to just have fun and let loose.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll discover some hidden talents along the way.
This whole conversation has been so inspiring. I feel like I'm walking away with a renewed sense of hope and a whole toolkit of ideas for supporting grieving kids and teens.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think it speaks to the power of Ursula's message. Creativity really can be a lifeline in times of grief.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, I want to encourage everyone listening to check out Ursula's course, Creativity as a Tool to Help Children and Adolescents, Going Through Bereavement and Loss. It's truly an invaluable resource for anyone who wants to learn more about how to navigate the complexities of childhood grief with compassion and creativity.
I couldn't agree more. And remember, even in the face of loss, there's always potential for healing, growth, and connection.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive for today. We'll include a link to Ursula's course in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. And until next time, keep diving deep and keep creating. It's amazing how much we've uncovered in this deep dive about how creativity can help kids and teens cope with loss. But one thing that really sticks with me is this idea of meeting them where they are in their grief journey. It's not about forcing them to fit into some mold of how we think they should be feeling or acting.
Absolutely. And that takes a lot of awareness on our part as adults because we all come with our own baggage around grief. We might have certain expectations or timelines based on our own experiences.
Right? It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking, oh, they should be over it by now, or they need to start talking about it more.
Exactly. But grief doesn't work like that. It's not linear, and there's no right or wrong way to go through it.
So how can we as parents and carers create that safe space for kids to grieve in their own way?
Well, first and foremost, it's about listening without judgment, really paying attention to what they're saying and how they're behaving.
And sometimes it's not even about saying anything. It's just about being present with them, offering a hug, a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on.
Exactly. And it's also about letting go of our need to fix things. Sometimes we just want to make the pain go away for our kids. But that's not always possible or even helpful.
Right, because grief is a natural part of life. It's something we all have to go through at some point.
Exactly. And by trying to shield kids from it or rush them through it, we're actually doing them a disservice.
So it's more about helping them navigate those waves of grief and learn how to cope with those big emotions.
Exactly. And that's where creativity can come in. It gives kids a way to express those feelings that might be too difficult to put into words.
We've talked a lot about the benefits of creative activities, but I'm wondering about the logistics. How can parents and carers actually make time for this in their already busy lives?
Well, Ursula offers some really practical advice in her course. She suggests thinking about it less as art therapy and more as just incorporating creative moments into your everyday routine.
So it's not about carving out a huge chunk of time for some elaborate art project. It's more about finding those little opportunities to weave in some creativity.
Exactly. Like maybe you set up a dedicated creative corner in your home with art supplies and other materials readily available.
I love that idea because it sends the message that creativity is always an option. It's not something you have to schedule or plan for.
Right. And it can be so simple, drawing together while you're having breakfast, putting on some music, and having a dance party, reading a story together, and then acting it out.
You're making me realize that creativity doesn't have to be this big formal thing. It can be
Yeah.
playful and spontaneous and just a part of everyday life.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be perfect either.
Right.
It's not about creating masterpieces. It's about the process of expressing yourself and having fun.
So true. And I think that's a really important message for both kids and adults.
Right.
We need to give ourselves permission to be messy and imperfect and just enjoy the creative journey.
Absolutely. And you know what? Sometimes the most creative moments happen when we least expect them, like when we're just hanging out with our kids and letting our imaginations run wild.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about being open to those unexpected bursts of creativity and recognizing that they can happen anywhere, anytime.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most powerful takeaways from Ursula's course. Creativity is not some special skill that only certain people have. It's something that's within all of us.
And it's something that can bring us so much joy and healing, especially during difficult times.
Absolutely. So to all the parents and carers out there who are navigating the ups and downs of grief with their kids, remember that you're not alone.
And remember that creativity can be a powerful tool for healing and connection. It's a way to express those big emotions, find solace, and maybe even rediscover a sense of joy amidst the pain.
Beautifully said. And I want to encourage everyone listening to check out Ursula Sisa's course, Creativity as a Tool to Help Children and Adolescents Going Through Bereavement and Loss. It's full of practical advice and inspiring stories that will give you a whole new perspective on grief and the power of creativity.
We'll be sure to include a link to the course in the show notes. And as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep connecting with the people you love.